Bret Hart is easily one of my favorite professional wrestlers of all time. But what wasn't my favorite was the portion of his career spent in WCW. However, there is a silver lining to all this, because even though it may not have been the best from the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be, I will say there are several matches that definitely stand out and are totally worth watching. What are those matches? Well, that's the topic of this episode, because today... This episode comes to you courtesy of the supporters over on Patreon, who voted to see an episode about Bret Hart. And I want to give a big shout out to my Patreon supporters, such as Cool Ass Jack, Tom Hughes, and Jeff Ang. Thank you to everyone for the support. I really do appreciate it, and it comes at a great time right now. So, thanks again. Alright, and now with that being said, let's get into the video. Starting us off on the list is DDP. Now, I do have to admit I have mixed feelings when it comes to this feud. Because after the screwjob and Bret coming off of a world title run that he never really lost, it seemed like a weird demotion to have him competing for a mid-card title when he had so much sympathy going for him. Just seemed like a really wasted opportunity that only served to prove right off the bat that WCW had absolutely no idea what to do with the excellence of execution. On the other hand, I did like the prestige that he brought to the United States title, a belt that, oddly enough, Bret would also win again in WWE. But ultimately, I do have to say that his matches with Page were entertaining, with Bret elevating DDP in what was at least a very engaging rivalry, despite Diamond Dallas Page having absolutely no idea how to do a sharpshooter. Next up is Roddy Piper. Now, this did not top their classic WrestleMania 8 match at all, but it was still very good by its own right for what it's worth. And how could this match be anything but good, especially considering that both men have a shared history, they're both really good in the ring, and they're great storytellers. On February 8th, 1999, Bret Hart and Roddy Piper would go back to fighting over a mid-card belt, just like they did during the WrestleMania 8 feud. And yes, this was just another example of WCW retreading an old WWE idea and not being able to pull it off quite as well, something that's sort of going to be a theme on this list. However, all in all, these two still put on a fantastic match, as they are going to every single time, especially since both of them were trained by Stu Hart, which is also the same for... well, we'll get to that later on. Speaking of another reboot of an old WWF match, let's take a look at Bret vs. Curt Hennig in WCW. Now to be clear, Bret vs. Mr. Perfect at SummerSlam 1991 is one of my absolute favorite matches of all time. But outside of that one match, I'm down for any time Mr. Perfect and Bret the Hitman Hart want to lock horns. So there's no way that this match wasn't going to make this list. At Uncensored 1998, Bret Hart would defeat Curt Hennig yet one more time, but in WCW. And while no, this again did not top their SummerSlam encounter in WWF, nor did it even surpass the lesser talked about King of the Ring bout in 1993, it's still a very, very good match, and there's absolutely no reason why the green-eyed monster needs to rear its ugly head, even though this bout did take place on the Ides of March. Now, in a change of pace, this is a match that did happen first in WWF. However, it was actually better in WCW. The Macho Man and Bret first tangled way back in 1987 on an episode of the Saturday Night's Main Event. And while this served its purpose of furthering the feud between Savage and Honky Tonk Man, with Bret getting some exposure as a solo act, the Hitman was merely just a cog in a greater story. However, at WCW Slamboree on the other hand, the two men met as equals, both being world champion caliber wrestlers and both putting on a fantastic showing. Now, I do have to say that the ending was a bit much, with interference tarnishing up the works with the NWO storyline getting in the way more than it helped, which is what kept this from being higher on the list. But just judging this match overall and from a wrestling standpoint, it's still a very solid match. In another match that previously happened in WWF, Bret Hart vs. Ric Flair probably has been seen more times in WCW than it ever was in the World Wrestling Federation. Now granted, Bret Hart winning his first ever world title off of Ric Flair was a historic moment, and the two would face off in numerous house shows for WWF. But when they did it in WCW, the two were allowed to put on a pay-per-view caliber match, being featured at Sold Out in 1998 and lasting over 18 minutes. Furthermore, this contest was also a nice change of pace, since wrestling at the time was heavily focused on outside interference, which was getting a bit tiresome. This allowed for the in-ring storytelling to really shine through, and since Flair was getting older and not the man he used to be a decade ago, these two storytelling masters really needed the opportunity to let their abilities excel, which they easily did. And on top of that, real life backstage heat tends to also add to the drama. Now, finally, on to a match that didn't happen in WWF, Booker T vs. Bret Hart. Booker T was a staple of WCW for years, easily being one of the best examples of what World Championship Wrestling had to offer, and the same could be said for Bret Hart when it comes to WWF. So after finally arriving on the scene, the two would go at it a handful of times, but it was one match in 1999 on an episode of Nitro that definitely rises above the rest. The two men were meeting at an interesting time in their careers, with Bret representing the old guard and Booker T being on his way to the main event, as even though we didn't know it at the time, Bret would be retiring the following year, and Booker would win his first world title. And finally, Bret the Hitman Hart's best match in WCW, as far as I'm concerned, is undoubtedly his bout against Chris Benoit. Like with Booker T, these two would wrestle in WCW and not WWF. They were also both trained in the dungeon, like with Piper, and they would also have a whole series of matches like Bret did with Flair, Hennig, and well, pretty much everybody on this list. Now, you could pick any one of the several matches between these two, including their bout at WCW Mayhem in 1999. However, as unfortunate as the circumstances were, I still consider their match that was done in honor of Owen Hart to be the finest encounter that these two men ever had, which is definitely saying something. Well, there you go, the 7 best matches from Bret Hart in WCW, but what are some of your favorites? Let me know down in the comments. And thank you so much for watching this video, as well as subscribing and giving it a like, which I'm sure you did, right? Alright, well, thanks again, and as always, Dave knows.